What I want to do is share with you our experience in BC around trying to develop what we thought would be a model that took into account all of the different elements people have talked to, had a series of checks and balances, that we thought would be our pathway to nirvana. It's a cautionary tale. So, originally, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane was going to be my subtitle, but I thought, no, that's really the title. So I want to go through kind of the history of how community living British Columbia came about and where things kind of unraveled, and then try to talk a bit about what I think the general lessons are that we can draw from that and take away. Just to give you a little bit of background, BC has, where's my little buttons? Oh, there's there. So prior to CLBC, we had a fairly typical system for Canada, so that the community living services were within our Ministry of Children and Family Development, which primary responsibility was child protection services, and they had a community living branch. And still today, to some degree, Canada developed what I think has been a very good model, where government is responsible for funding and the policy frameworks, and the services are provided through contracts with various small and medium community organizations and increasingly for-profit organizations. So that was kind of the system in a nutshell. And I'm sorry, this is going to be very high level and very quick in a lot of cases. In 2001, we had a new government, which, not unusual these days, came in with a robust mandate to cut costs and rein in expenditure and waste in government. They proposed significant cuts right across government, not just to social services, but social services were not spared from those cuts. And part of their plan was to devolve both child welfare and community living services out of government into what we would call a crown corporation, so a quasi-government agency that reports to government but has an independent board. Very common here and I think elsewhere now. So in response to this, we had some of our leaders of the community living movement spoke to the government about this and started to work with families and community living groups to bring them together to respond to this. And we were somewhat comfortable going in the sense that we had a minister at the time who actually had a long history and connection with community living, who was a man who actually read John McKnight, who believed in community and was committed to working with us. And basically, the simple deal that was struck was, okay, we'll go along with this plan for devolution if the community can design it and can say what it looks like and can control the process. And at the time, the minister essentially agreed to that. So what happened was we formed what we call the Community Living Coalition. And the coalition was really, since the early days of deinstitutionalization, the strongest coming together of the community living movement. Service providers, self-advocates, family groups, all came together and formed this coalition to oversee this process and negotiate the process with government. So the coalition's goals at the time were to address the threatened cutbacks coming to the sector, to develop this new governance structure for community living, and to promote individualized funding as an option for individuals and families. As I think has been said by others, BC has a long history of talking about individualized funding and brokerage since the mid-70s with the Woodlands Parents Groups. We had several abortive attempts, but it had never gotten traction. So that was going to be a key aim of this process. So in April 2002, Minister Gordon Hogue appointed a 25-member, what was called the Community Living Transition Steering Committee, and they were charged with designing this new system and proposing to government what this new Crown Corporation should look like. And quite remarkably, he was very comfortable with that group being primarily self-advocates and family members and community members. So there's a majority of people funded, supported, empowered by government to do this design. So far, so good. And the majority of those members were drawn from the Community Living Coalition, and we would report back. The coalition met initially every couple of weeks, every month, and we would have 100, 200 people come together from across the province to review, to advise, control. So it was a very grounded process, at that point, very united process across most of the community living. Not 100%, but when is there ever 100%? So the Community Living Transition Steering Committee worked for a couple of years, meeting, was it bi-weekly, every 2 weeks? To spend usually 2 days at a time collectively working through this. We had a number of subcommittees. We had groups working on the model, the planning sector, the media side, funding side. So it was a very, very intense process. And basically the upshot was recommended this provincial governance authority called Community Living British Columbia, which would have responsibility both for adults and children. So that was a significant change, that we wanted to bring children out of the Ministry of Children and Families to, A, remove them from a protection lens, which was the primary lens and should be the primary lens of children and families, and to try to smooth out the problem of transition. Because like a lot of jurisdictions, kids got supported by one system until they turned 19, and then they had to change. So we wanted to try to smooth out that process. So the Community Living Authority Act was the act that empowers Community Living BC. It was passed in 2004. Included in that act was the most controversial element, and the one that was the hardest fought for us, and that was that the board of this new authority, responsible for at that time about a $750 million budget, would have a legislative requirement that the board be 50% plus one family members or self-advocates. It's actually phrased slightly different, but that was the intention. By this time we were on to a new minister. This is the PG-rated version. If anybody wants the R-rated version of what went on, we'll have to do that another time. Because there were moments. So the new service model was announced, and it formally was established just over 10 years ago now, in July 2005. This was the final report, still available to look at. And the key elements will look familiar to you were the elements we've been talking about here: community governance, operationally independent planning support, individualized funding, and an integration of children and adults. It was sort of the cornerstones of the new model. This is what it looked like, and we very intentionally reversed the direction of a normal map. So the idea here was, if you look at the left and the right, the planning was separated from the decision-making around eligibility and finances through these two arms, which only met at the CEO. Now that was a compromise, and it was because government said they would not allow us to set up a separate independent planning network. So our compromise was to split them within the organization and have them only meet at the top. There were two key roles. The facilitators would be responsible for the planning, advice, support, kind of the brokerage type role, no decision-making role, and a very explicit role that their mandate was community-wide. It wasn't to broker services, it was to find the best way to actualize people's goals and life dreams with them. And the analyst would only be responsible for eligibility funding determinations. So they were to operate both structurally separate, but we actually set them in different offices because we didn't want the money people influencing the planning people. So, the best laid plans. So things started to go sideways fairly quickly before the implementation. We cycled through 4 ministers, each one less and less committed to the original government plan. Even though it was their plan, by the end it was like we were advocating for doing what they had asked us to do to begin with. Very early on, there was a significant funding squeeze because the government, obviously a big part of the plan was to reduce funding, and very quickly they put pressure on CLBC to do that. And really, unfortunately, the response of CLBC at that time basically was to abandon much of the core principles of choice and control for a cost-driven system. So very quickly created a strong alienation to the community and the group that set it up. There was no significant change management, or probably more importantly, culture change plan to make this transition happen. Initially, there was a lot of staff development to help bring culture change within the staff. That very quickly was abandoned, again, partly to cost. Children were never fully transferred. They were initially kind of transferred on an MOU and then taken back to MCFD. Again, new ministers. The Community Living Act was revised to remove the provision around board composition. There was restructuring so that the analysts and the facilitators were both physically brought together and brought much closer together at a time of fiscal pressure. Not surprisingly, the analysts who control the money thing very quickly came to dominate the structure, and there was no structural safeguards left in place. There was a very strong public backlash, much of which was around the wait list and the transition issues. The ministry, which was now the Ministry of Social Development, was responsible. They implemented what's called a Deputy Minister's Review, but, and this is a very biased analysis, essentially it was a tool to reassert control over CLBC. And it was a very on-the-ground control in terms of oversight on any public communications by what was supposed to be an independent authority, et cetera, et cetera. So they also came up and said, well, because a lot of these issues are transition, they created what was called a STAD program, which is essentially transition navigators who work for the ministry and not CLBC. They had no resources, they were simply a navigator, and in and of itself, it was a good plan. Now, if you're connecting the dots very quickly, basically, they were solving the problem which was partially created by removing the children from CLBC and recreating the original facilitator role that CLBC was supposed to have in a whole new entity. So we now have a whole nother bureaucratic structure doing what the original system was intended to do. IF never became a priority. I'll go real quick. At this point, there's only, the last looking was only about 196 users, and that's out of about a total CLBC service population of around 16,000. So very small. There has been a very excellent review done of that, and if some of you caught their presentation, excellent analysis. In that analysis, families said things like, well, information's haphazard, things we've heard from other groups. The facilitators didn't know about it, or if they didn't like it, they didn't support it or recommend it. And at this point now, what we have is a very significant loss of institutional memory. Very few people within the system or the ministry actually understood what the original structure was supposed to do and how it was supposed to work. So we're kind of back to square one. And we knew at the beginning one of the risks with the Crown Corp was what I call the fig leaf scenario. The reason governments like Crown Corps is they can control the budget and the Crown Corp can take the blame when things go sideways. And to some degree, that's that's happened. The other was this problem around the planning role. So I will skip now to my quick key lessons that I think we can draw from it. So as we've heard from separating that planning role, keeping it independent, keeping it away from all of that other stuff is critical, but it's really hard to do. Clearly, I'm not alone in that thought. Being really clear about the respective roles and domains of community and government, robust change management plans, and legislation that gives people a right to IF, strong community-based information sources. That the most effective IF implementation currently in BC is really through the work of VELA, which has contract to provide information. Keeping in mind that, I'll wrap it up now. Keep in mind, there is no perfect system. And I think if there's one big lesson yes, freedom has to be struggled for, but it equally has to be struggled to protect. And I think that's where we dropped the ball. We thought we had developed a perfect system. Everybody packed up their tent and went home and said we can relax. And 10 years later, here we are. Thank you.